The end of World War II left not only devastation but thousands of captured Japanese aircraft, once symbols of innovation and destruction, now abandoned or discarded. In the wake of the war, these warplanes were seen as burdens rather than assets, too costly to maintain, too obsolete for the new technological era. As the Allies transitioned into the Cold War, these aircraft, once feared in the skies, faced a future of disassembly, neglect, and forgotten legacies. What would become of these machines, once the pride of a lost empire? Their fate was decided by pragmatism, economic pressures, and the inevitable march of time, leaving only memories of their role in history. After the ink had dried on the surrender documents in 1945, the world turned its eyes to the vast wreckage left by the Second World War. Thousands of aircraft, from the sturdiest bombers to the most agile fighters, now sat idle on both sides of the globe. Some were already forgotten, while others had only just been captured, their future uncertain. Among these were the Japanese aircraft, machines once symbols of deadly innovation, now nothing more than relics of a lost empire. What would become of these captured machines, symbols of Japan's aerial ambitions and the horrors of war? The answer to this question was shaped by a strange mix of pragmatism, economic pressure, and a creeping uncertainty about what to do with the war's spoils. These aircraft, whether still intact, partially dismantled, or heavily damaged, presented both a logistical headache and an undeniable opportunity. The scale of the task was staggering. In the Pacific alone, the Allies had seized over 2,500 Japanese aircraft by the war's end. Many were sitting in fields, forgotten airstrips, or hastily abandoned hangars, while others were taken back to the United States and Australia for evaluation and potential reuse. Yet, the immediate need for such aircraft had evaporated. The war was over. Their purpose had died with the conflict, and they no longer served the strategic or tactical needs of their captors. The economic pressures facing the victorious powers after 1945 made the fate of these aircraft all the more complicated. For the United States, Britain, and Australia, resources were scarce. Economies that had been mobilized for total war had to pivot to peacetime production. What had once been a race to build more planes, more weapons, more ships, now turned into a race to disassemble and discard the war's remnants. The planes, many of them requiring extensive maintenance and repair, were seen as both an asset and a burden. Keeping them in service was costly, and many were too obsolete to remain competitive in the post-war world of emerging jet fighters and advanced technology. The United States, for example, found itself with thousands of Japanese aircraft spread across the Pacific. While many had been captured in varying degrees of disrepair, others were mostly intact, even airworthy. In the wake of the war, however, there was little interest in preserving these machines. The U.S. Army Air Forces had no use for them, their technology outdated compared to the cutting-edge designs that were emerging on both sides. In fact, a decision was quickly made. The captured planes were to be dismantled, scrapped for parts, or simply abandoned. In 1947, the U.S. Air Force began disposing of the majority of its stock, leading to the destruction of hundreds of aircraft. Many were sold off for pennies or handed over to military contractors for parts scavenging. What had once been fearsome machines, dominating the skies during the Pacific conflict, were now little more than metal husks, subject to the whims of scrap dealers. At the same time, some of these captured aircraft were carefully studied. In the immediate post-war years, the U.S. military was keenly aware of Japan's technological advancements, particularly in aviation. The Japanese had developed aircraft that rivaled or even outpaced some of the best American designs, and many of these machines were seen as potential treasures of technological insight. The most famous of these was the Mitsubishi A-6M0, a naval fighter that had wreaked havoc on Allied forces at the war's outset. After the war, several of these planes were carefully preserved and reverse-engineered to assess their design and capabilities. But even this process had its limits. The cost of maintaining these aircraft, let alone updating them to make them viable in a rapidly evolving technological landscape, was simply too high. In Australia, the situation was not much different. At the end of the war, the Royal Australian Air Force found itself in possession of a considerable number of captured Japanese aircraft, including the formidable Ki-43 Oscar and the N-1K-2J Sheridan. These planes were initially seen as potential assets for the RAAF, but economic pressures quickly led to a reassessment. The planes had few uses beyond training and testing, and the resources required to maintain them were better spent on more modern, Western designs. As a result, Australia followed a similar path to the United States, dismantling the majority of the captured aircraft, saving only those of particular interest for further study. For Japan, the sight of its once proud air force reduced to rubble was nothing short of tragic. In the immediate post-war years, the country was under strict Allied control, and the notion of rebuilding its air force was far from a priority. The aircraft that had once filled the skies over the Pacific, the very machines that had symbolized Japan's military might, were now part of a distant past. With no immediate need for them and no economic capacity to restore them, these planes were either left to decay or sold off to the highest bidder. Some of them ended up in civilian hands, where they were repurposed for crop dusting, training, or even used as novelties for aviation enthusiasts. Yet, not all captured Japanese aircraft met such a grim fate. Some found new lives in unexpected ways. A handful of the Zero fighters, prized for their agility and craftsmanship, were kept for display and later used for historical purposes. These relics of war, sitting in museum collections across the world, became testaments to an era of technological competition, national pride, and ultimately, destruction. Some would even be restored to fly once again, though these instances were few and far between. But for the most part, the captured Japanese aircraft were either discarded or reduced to parts. The sheer scale of their presence and the logistical challenges of maintaining them in any meaningful way made it impossible for many countries to do anything but scrap them. In the U.S., some parts were salvaged and used in other aircraft, while others were melted down or sold as surplus. By the late 1940s, the majority of these aircraft had been stripped of anything of value, reduced to little more than scrap metal. The remaining few that survived were often relegated to museums, where they would be carefully preserved as historical artifacts. But the fate of the majority was stark. They were simply forgotten, their role in the war reduced to footnotes in history. The uncertainty surrounding these aircraft mirrored the uncertainty of the post-war world itself. Much like the nations that had emerged from the rubble of the war, the captured aircraft had no clear future. Their fate, though inevitable, was still unfolding as decisions were being made, decisions that would determine whether these machines would be remembered, scrapped, or left to decay. The post-war era continued to bring about profound changes, and the fate of the captured Japanese aircraft mirrored the evolving geopolitical landscape and technological shift of the time. By the early 1950s, the air forces of the Allied powers had largely turned their attention to the emerging threat of the Soviet Union, with a new Cold War taking shape. The legacy of the war in the Pacific, however, continued to linger in the form of these aircraft, which were now mostly seen as obsolete. Still, their role as historical artifacts, military curiosities, and even potential sources of information about Japanese engineering and combat tactics ensured they did not fade into complete obscurity. But for the majority of these planes, the inevitable reality remained. They were either dismantled or repurposed for civilian use in ways that no one could have predicted at the war's height. As the war's immediate aftermath began to settle, the U.S. military, which had seized the lion's share of the captured aircraft, had to determine what to do with the thousands of planes now filling storage yards and abandoned airfields. The wartime need for these aircraft was gone, and there was little enthusiasm for retaining machines that were quickly becoming outdated. For the U.S. military, the transition from a wartime footing to a peacetime one came with a considerable shift in priorities. The planes that had once been valuable tools in the fight for global dominance were now nothing more than burdens. The vast stockpile of captured Japanese aircraft, most of which were seen as technologically inferior to the latest American models, was no longer a pressing asset. The financial realities of the post-war world also played a significant role in determining the fate of these planes. The United States, despite its vast industrial capabilities, was facing its own set of economic challenges. The Great Depression still cast long shadows in some corners of the economy, while the war had drained resources that could have been put toward reconstruction or civilian projects. This was not a time for idle luxury. Each dollar spent on maintaining captured aircraft was a dollar that could not be invested elsewhere, particularly in emerging technologies. The jet age had begun, and the post-war U.S. Air Force was already shifting its focus to the development of high-performance jets, such as the F-86 Sabre and the F-100 Super Sabre. These planes, which were far more advanced and promising in terms of combat capability, made the Japanese aircraft increasingly irrelevant. Some of the captured aircraft were put through rigorous testing and reverse engineering, but this was a costly and time-consuming process. Engineers sought to understand what made these planes tick, what innovative design principles, materials, or strategies could be adapted for American use. Yet, even this was done with a sense of detachment. The Japanese aircraft were, in many ways, just another puzzle to be solved, a series of components that might yield valuable insights, but no more. Very few of these planes would ever see combat again, and the costs of preserving them for research soon outweighed their potential benefits. By the mid-1950s, the U.S. government had made the decision to dispose of nearly all of the captured aircraft. In some instances, a select few planes, often those of historical significance, were kept for museums or displayed at air shows, but these were the exceptions. For the most part, the captured aircraft were stripped of their useful parts, and the remains were sold as scrap. An entire industry of metal salvaging sprang up, with vast quantities of the aircraft being melted down, their valuable metals recycled for use in the burgeoning post-war economy. The machines that had once soared across the skies, painted with the insignias of a war-torn empire, now met their end as they were fed into smelting furnaces. While the United States focused its efforts on dismantling the captured aircraft, other nations, particularly those in the Pacific Theater, faced a more complicated dilemma. Australia, for example, had captured a smaller number of Japanese aircraft but still found itself with a considerable stockpile of planes. The Royal Australian Air Force, after initially examining the planes, quickly realized that they had no real strategic need for these machines. Like the Americans, the RAF was transitioning into the jet age, with a growing interest in high-performance jet fighters. The time and cost required to repair, maintain, and operate the captured Japanese aircraft were simply not justified by any potential military value. Australia's solution mirrored that of its American counterpart. Most of the captured planes were dismantled, while a few of the most unique or interesting examples were preserved for historical purposes. Some of the aircraft were even sold off or gifted to aviation enthusiasts. In one of the more unusual fates, a handful of captured Japanese planes were repurposed for civilian aviation. The Ki-43 Oscars, known for their agility in battle, were sometimes used for civilian purposes like crop dusting, a strange turn of events for these once deadly warplanes. Similarly, a few N-1K-2J Sheridan aircraft were employed for training purposes or occasionally appeared at air shows, becoming nothing more than curiosities of a bygone era. For Japan, the destruction of its aircraft after the war marked a painful moment in its history. The machines that had represented its military prowess were now stripped of their military value, their fates decided by the very countries that had defeated them. The inability of the Japanese government to reclaim or retain many of these aircraft spoke volumes about Japan's precarious position in the post-war world. Still under occupation and with a weakened industrial base, the country had little ability to recover its war machines. Some of the planes, as already noted, ended up in the hands of private collectors or museums. But for the most part, Japan was left to focus on rebuilding its economy and infrastructure, not on reclaiming the technological marvels that had once dominated the skies. Interestingly, some of the captured aircraft did find a way to outlive their initial obsolescence. By the 1960s, with the advent of the space race and the rise of historical aviation enthusiasm, there was a renewed interest in these machines. Collectors, war enthusiasts, and museums began to recognize the value of these old warplanes, not just as military tools, but as pieces of history. The Zero, in particular, became an object of fascination. Some were painstakingly restored, returning to flight in a form that had not been seen since the closing days of the Pacific conflict. But this resurgence of interest was limited. Only a few aircraft were preserved, and these were largely the exception rather than the rule. Most captured Japanese aircraft continued to fade into history, their remains left to rust away in the corners of forgotten airfields. What once had been symbols of deadly ingenuity, used to great effect during the war, were now relegated to the status of forgotten relics, their final fates sealed by the overwhelming forces of progress and time. As the decades passed, the few remaining examples of the captured Japanese aircraft came to represent something different, pieces of a history that was slowly being forgotten. The people who had once been the greatest enemies of the Allies were now far removed from the world that had made these planes so crucial. The aircraft were no longer a symbol of battle, but of an era that had passed, leaving behind only remnants of its violence, ambition, and lost opportunities. Some of these planes, preserved in museums or tucked away in private collections, now stand as silent witnesses to a world that no longer exists. Their history, once so inextricably tied to the events of World War II, is now remembered only through the stories of those who lived through that time. In the quiet halls of aviation museums, these planes continue to evoke a sense of awe, not for their role in the war, but for the way they have survived, in some form, into an entirely new era. Yet, for most of the captured aircraft, their final fate was far less dramatic. They were melted down, discarded, or allowed to rust away, fading into the backdrop of history. The captured Japanese planes, now little more than distant echoes of a past conflict, remind us of the nature of war's aftermath. The destruction of technology, the abandonment of old empires, and the sometimes merciless march of progress all conspired to erase the legacy of these once feared machines.